Welcome back to our AllScripture Devotions. Thank you for sharing and commenting on the previous one. Make sure that you subscribe and hit the notification bell to know when our next videos are coming out. Today I want to start a series on faith. So I want to ask you, what is faith? The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines faith in two contradictory ways. They define faith as a firm belief in something for which there is no proof. And yet they also define it as something that is believed, especially with strong conviction. For me, that doesn't make sense. For how can you have a strong conviction for something that there is no proof in? That is not the biblical definition of faith. So we have to understand it from the biblical point of view. What you need to realize is that the Bible was not written in English. The Bible was written in Koine Greek and in Hebrew. So therefore, we have to understand these words in this perspective, in this context. So, the Greek word used for faith is pistis, P-I-S-T-I-S. It comes from the original word pitho, which means to persuade or be persuaded. So therefore, faith is persuasion. The word faith in the original Greek is a legal term. It actually means a persuasion. In a courtroom, there are essentially two sides arguing for truth. In a court of law, the prosecutor and defense both argue from their perspectives. They argue to convince the judge and the jury whether the defendant is innocent or guilty. When the judge and jury are convinced of the evidence, their perspective changes. They're persuaded to side with where the evidence leads to. If, for example, the prosecutor argues that the defendant is guilty, and the judge and jury are convinced of this and they unanimously decide a guilty verdict, they are essentially adopting the prosecutor's perspective. They are persuaded to stand on the side of the prosecutor's point of view. So you could say metaphorically that the judge and the jury, they walk towards the side of the prosecutor, persuaded that the crime was seen from the prosecutor's point of view. Faith is persuasion. When we walk by faith, it means that we walk persuaded. 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7 says that we walk by faith, not by sight. So therefore, when we walk by faith and not by sight, we are walking persuaded. We are walking by shifting our perspective from our own earthly perspective to God's perspective. We're shifting from the way that we see life and human history, from our limited perspective, to accepting and admitting that God's perspective is better. What happens in a courtroom is that when a witness testifies of what they see of the crime, their testimony is written down verbatim and is taken to be truth. See, God's perspective of our lives is written as a testimony in the Bible. The Bible is God's personal testimony for how He sees the world. See, the Bible is written in the Old and the New Testaments. 1 John 5 verse 9 says we accept human testimony, but God's testimony is greater because it is the testimony of God which He has given about His Son. You see, the Bible is human history in God's perspective. To walk by faith and not by sight is not to deny our own earthly time-bound perspectives. It's rather to admit that our perspectives are limited to an eternal God who sees the end from the beginning. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. You see, God's perspective is eternal. To walk by faith is to be persuaded of God's perspective. To walk by faith is to be persuaded of God's arguments written in His personal testimony. Let me ask you, what is God's perspective for your situation? What is God's perspective for your life? Right now, what I'm doing is I'm essentially preaching. The word preach in the original Greek is kerusso. It means to herald, proclaim, to preach a message publicly and with conviction or persuasion. Really, all preaching is persuasion, persuading you to believe in life from God's perspective. Paul was trying to persuade a king of Judea. His name was King Agrippa. And in this context, Paul is summoned before Agrippa and he's asked to testify for why he believes that Christ has been raised from the dead. I encourage you to read it. It says this in Acts 26, verse 28 to 29. Agrippa replied to Paul, "In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian." Paul replies to this and says, "I would wish to God that whether in a short time or a long time, not only you, but also all who hear me to this day might become such as I am, except for these chains." Paul's heart is for us to believe, for us to be persuaded that God exists, that God is real. In our next devotion, we're going to talk more about faith. But in this episode, I want to ask you, are you willing to be persuaded? Are you willing to be open to see God's perspective for your life? Are you willing to say, as King Agrippa said, "In a short time you will persuade me to become a Christian"? Faith is not believing in things that don't have any evidence. Faith is not believing in things that don't have any proof. Faith is not blindness. Faith is believing with persuasion. Let me know any questions that you might have, any comments that you might have right now about this topic. I want to make it interactive. But make sure you share so that people can know, people can really understand what we believe. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next devotion.